December 1944, Ortona, Italy. The sound of German machine gun fire ripped through the cold morning air like 1,000 angry hornets. 47 Canadian soldiers pressed their bodies flat against the frozen rubble of what used to be a bakery. The MG-42 machine guns kept firing, their bullets chewing up the stone walls above the Canadians' heads. Dust and broken brick rained down on them with each burst of fire. Corporal James McLeod kept his face in the dirt and listened. He heard something that made his blood run cold. The Germans were laughing. Even over the sound of their own guns firing, he could hear them laughing and shouting to each other in German. McLeod didn't speak German, but he knew they were making fun of something. He knew they were making fun of the Canadian Bren guns. The Bren gun was the main weapon the Canadian infantry used against enemy positions. It fired 500 rounds every minute. That sounds like a lot until you know what the Germans had. The German MG-42 fired 1,200 rounds every minute, more than twice as fast. The Germans called it Hitler's buzzsaw because of the terrible ripping sound it made. When an MG-42 opened fire, it sounded like cloth being torn apart, but 1,000 times louder. McLeod lifted his head just enough to see across the street. 3 German machine gun teams had set up perfect positions. They were 85 meters away on one side, 120 meters on the other, and one more position straight ahead at 95 meters. The Germans had caught the Canadians in a killing zone that stretched 200 meters. Every time a Canadian soldier moved even a little bit, all 3 guns would open fire at once. 9 Canadian soldiers were already hit in the first 4 minutes. The medics couldn't even reach them because of the fire. McLeod watched as bullets kicked up dirt and stone all around the wounded men. The German guns just kept firing and firing. They seemed to have endless ammunition. Lieutenant Harrison crawled up next to McLeod. His face was covered in brick dust, and his helmet had a fresh bullet scratch across it. "McLeod, we need to pull back," Harrison shouted over the noise. "We can't win a firefight against those MG-42s. They're putting out too much fire. That's what command always says. More bullets win the fight." McLeod shook his head. He'd heard this thinking before, back in training, back in England, even here in Italy. The idea was simple. Whoever fired the most bullets would win. Volume of fire was everything. But McLeod had learned something different growing up in the forests of Nova Scotia. Before the war, McLeod had been a hunting guide. He took rich men from the cities out into the deep woods to hunt deer and bear. Those city hunters always wanted to fire as many shots as possible. They thought more bullets meant more hits. But McLeod learned early that the hunters who took their time, who aimed carefully, who fired one perfect shot, those were the ones who went home with meat. "Just give me 10 minutes, McLeod said to Harrison. The lieutenant looked at him like he was crazy. 10 minutes was a long time to stay pinned down. 10 minutes meant more wounded men, maybe men who wouldn't make it. But Harrison had seen McLeod shoot in training. The man could hit a playing card at 100 yards with his Bren gun, not just near it. Hit it dead center. 10 minutes, Harrison said, but if this doesn't work, we're pulling back and calling in artillery. McLeod nodded and crawled over to where 3 other Bren gun teams were hiding behind a knockdown wall. Each Bren gun weighed 8.85 kilograms. Each one had a 30-round magazine that sat on top of the gun instead of underneath. A lot of soldiers didn't like that design. They said it made the gun awkward. The magazine stuck up and caught on things. The Bren also fired the .303 round. This was smaller than what the German MG-42 fired. Some of the Allied commanders worried about this. They thought the .303 was too weak. They wished the Canadians had heavier guns that fired bigger bullets. The Germans certainly thought the .303 was weak. That's why they were laughing. McLeod set up his Bren gun on its small bipod legs. The bipod let the gun sit steady while you aimed. The other Bren gunners watched him. "What are we doing, Corporal?" one of them asked. His name was Private Chen. He was only 19 years old, and this was his first real battle. "We're going to aim," McLeod said. The other gunners looked confused. They'd been firing back at the Germans the whole time. Of course they were aiming, but McLeod meant something different. He watched the German positions carefully. He counted in his head. The MG-42 on the left would fire for 8 seconds, then stop for 4 seconds to reload. The one in the center fired for 6 seconds, then stopped for 5 seconds. The one on the right fired for 7 seconds, stopped for 3 seconds. The Germans were good, but they followed patterns. All soldiers follow patterns. McLeod had learned that hunting, too. Animals follow patterns, even dangerous animals, even predators. "They think their speed beats our aim," McLeod said quietly to the other gunners. "They think 1,200 rounds beats 500 rounds. But they're wrong about something important. They're measuring the wrong thing." The other Bren gunners leaned in closer to hear. The MG-42s were still tearing up the wall above them, but they needed to know the plan. "Every one of their 1-200 bullets sprays all over the place," McLeod said. "Maybe 1 in 20 hits anything. But our guns, our Bren guns, they're different. We can put a bullet exactly where we want it, every single time, from 600 yards away if we need to." McLeod looked at each man. "So here's what we're going to do. We're not going to spray and pray. We're going to wait, aim, and fire 3 to 5 rounds at a time, right at their gunners, right when they're reloading, when they can't shoot back." Private Chen swallowed hard. What if it doesn't work? McLeod set his cheek against the Bren gun stock. He looked down the sight at the German position on the left. "Then the lieutenant calls in the artillery and we get out of here." "But I think it's going to work. I think those Germans are about to learn something about Canadian guns." McLeod positioned the 3 Bren gun teams in a staggered line behind the broken wall. Each team was spread out about 10 meters from the next. This wasn't how they usually did it. Normal tactics said to bunch up for more firepower. But McLeod wanted each team to have a clear shot at different German positions. He wanted them spread out so the Germans couldn't hit all 3 teams with one burst of fire. The Bren gun itself was a simple weapon, and that was part of what made it so good. It weighed 8.85 kilograms, which was light enough for one man to carry easily, but heavy enough to stay steady when firing. The barrel was 635 millimeters long, and it could hit targets accurately at 600 yards. That's more than 5 football fields away. But today, the Germans were much closer, just 85 to 120 meters. At that distance, the Bren gun could put a bullet through a coin if the shooter knew what he was doing. The magazine sat on top of the gun and held 30 rounds. McLeod had 12 magazines lined up next to him on the ground. That gave him 360 rounds total. The other 2 Bren teams had the same, just over 1,000 rounds between all 3 guns. It sounded like a lot, but the Germans had fired more than that already in just the last few minutes. McLeod assigned each team a specific target. Private Chen and his loader would watch the German position on the left, the one that was 85 meters away. That gun fired in 8-second bursts, then went quiet for 4 seconds. Private Walsh and his team would take the center position at 95 meters. That gun fired for 6 seconds and reloaded for 5. McLeod himself would handle the position on the right at 120 meters. 7 seconds of fire, 3 seconds to reload. "We wait for the reload," McLeod explained again. "When they stop firing to put in a new belt of ammunition, that's when we shoot. Aim at the gunner first. If you can't see the gunner clearly, aim at the muzzle flash. That's where he is. 3 to 5 rounds, no more. Then wait for the next reload." Private Walsh shook his head. "Corporal, with respect, that's not going to be enough fire. We need to keep shooting to keep their heads down. That's what they taught us. suppressing fire. McLeod understood the concern. Every soldier in the Canadian Army had been taught the same thing. When you're in a firefight, you lay down as much fire as you can. You make the enemy too scared to lift their heads. You pin them down with bullets. But that doctrine was written for normal battles, for open fields and long-range fighting. This was different. This was close-up street fighting where every bullet mattered. In the woods back home, McLeod said, if you miss a deer with your first shot, you don't get a second one. The deer hears the shot and runs. It's gone. These German gunners are the same. If we spray bullets everywhere, they'll just keep their heads down and keep firing. But if we wait, aim, and drop their gunners one by one, the whole position falls apart. Lieutenant Harrison crawled back over. He'd been checking on the wounded men. 2 more soldiers had been hit while McLeod was setting up his plan. That made 11 casualties now. The other 36 men in the platoon were all watching to see what would happen. Some of them looked hopeful. Most of them looked scared. McLeod, Captain Reynolds is on the radio, Harrison said. He wants us to pull back right now. He says we're taking too many casualties. He says we should retreat and let the artillery pound the street. McLeod's jaw tightened. Captain Reynolds was a by-the-book officer. He followed every rule, every doctrine. If the manual said retreat when outgunned, Reynolds would retreat. Sir, just give us the 10 minutes we talked about. If this doesn't work in 10 minutes, I'll help carry the wounded back myself. Harrison looked at the German positions. The MG-42s were still firing in their patterns. 8 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 5 seconds, 7 seconds, 3 seconds, like clockwork. Reynolds says you're going to get more men killed with this crazy hunting guide nonsense. Sir, you saw me shoot in training, McLeod said. You know what the Bren can do when you aim it properly. Harrison had seen it. Back in England, before they shipped out to Italy, McLeod had put on a demonstration. He'd hit 20 targets at 100 meters with 20 shots. No misses. The other soldiers had thought it was luck, but Harrison had watched McLeod's technique. The way he controlled his breathing. The way he squeezed the trigger smoothly instead of jerking it. The way he adjusted for even the smallest amount of wind. McLeod wasn't lucky. He was skilled. You've got your 10 minutes, Harrison said, but Reynolds wants confirmation every 2 minutes. If this goes wrong, it's both our necks. McLeod nodded and settled in behind his Bren gun. He clicked off the safety and put his finger alongside the trigger guard. Not on the trigger yet, not until the moment was right. He could feel his heart beating in his chest. Steady, not too fast. That was good. His hands weren't shaking. That was good too. The German MG-42 on the right stopped firing. McLeod counted in his head. 1, 2, 3. On 3, he moved his finger to the trigger. He found the German gunner in his sights. The man was bent over his weapon, feeding in a new belt of ammunition. His head and shoulders were visible above the sandbags. McLeod squeezed the trigger. The Bren gun made its distinctive sound, tack, tack, tack. 3 rounds. The first hit the sandbag in front of the gunner. The second hit the German in the shoulder. The third hit him in the chest. The German gunner fell backward. His partner jumped up to take his place, and McLeod fired 3 more rounds. The partner dropped too. On the left, Private Chen was firing. Tack, 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 tack. 4 rounds, then silence. Then tack, tack, tack. 3 more rounds. In the center, Walsh was shooting. 5 rounds, then waiting. Then 4 more. The German MG-42 on the right tried to fire again. A third German soldier had jumped behind the gun, but McLeod was already aiming. 3 rounds. The gun went silent. No one else rushed to take the position. The other Germans were staying down now. They'd realized something was very wrong. 90 seconds had passed since McLeod fired his first shot. He'd used 23 rounds from his first magazine. Chen had used 21 rounds. Walsh had used 20 rounds. That was 64 rounds total. And 2 of the 3 German positions were completely silent. No more laughing, no more firing, just quiet. The 3rd German position, the one in the center, was still trying to shoot back, but the gunner was firing wild now. His bullets were going high, hitting the buildings behind the Canadians. He was scared. McLeod could tell by the way the gun was moving. Quick, jerky movements instead of smooth sweeps. Lieutenant Harrison was staring at the German positions with his mouth open. "It's actually working," he whispered. McLeod, "It's actually working." The last German machine gun went silent after 6 minutes of fighting. 6 minutes. That was all it took for McLeod and his 2 Bren gun teams to break an ambush that should have killed or wounded every Canadian soldier on that street. The silence that followed was almost louder than the gunfire had been. The Canadians could hear their own breathing. They could hear the wind blowing through the broken buildings. They could hear Christmas decorations that Italian families had hung before the war, now rattling against bombed-out window frames. Lieutenant Harrison looked at his watch and then looked at McLeod. When the ambush first started, 9 soldiers had been wounded in just 4 minutes. 2 more were hit while McLeod set up his plan, bringing the total to 11 casualties. The math had been terrible. At that rate, every man in the platoon would have been hit in less than 20 minutes. But now, after just 6 minutes of McLeod's precision fire, the shooting had stopped. The ambush was broken, and the Canadians had only used 64 rounds to do it. The medics rushed forward to help the wounded. Other soldiers moved up carefully, their rifles ready. When they reached the German positions, they found 15 German soldiers dead or badly wounded. Most of them were machine gunners or their assistants, the men who fed the ammunition belts, the men who carried spare barrels. McLeod's Bren teams had aimed for the gunners first, and it had worked exactly like he said it would. The smell of cordite hung heavy in the cold December air, that sharp, metallic smell that gets in your nose and throat after guns have been firing. It mixed with the dust from all the broken bricks and stone. McLeod's ears were ringing from the noise, but he could still hear the distinct sound his Bren gun made. Tech, tech, tech. It was so different from the German MG42's terrible ripping sound. The Bren sounded almost polite compared to the German gun, but polite had won the fight. Private Chen was shaking as he unloaded his Bren gun. "I can't believe that worked, Corporal," he said. "I thought for sure we were all going to die on this street." McLeod put a hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "You aimed. That's what made it work. You didn't panic and spray bullets everywhere. You aimed." Word of what happened spread through the Canadian forces faster than anyone expected. By that evening, officers from other companies were coming to talk to McLeod. They wanted to know exactly what he'd done, how he'd positioned his guns, how he'd timed the shots, how he'd beaten 3 MG42s with 3 Bren guns that fired half as fast. Captain Reynolds, the officer who'd wanted to retreat, came to see McLeod personally. Reynolds didn't apologize exactly. Officers like him didn't apologize. But he did say, "That was good work today, Corporal. Unconventional, but good work." Then Reynolds did something surprising. He told every Bren gunner in the battalion to come listen to McLeod explain his tactics. Over the next 3 weeks, Canadian units all across the Italian front started using McLeod's precision fire method. They stopped trying to match the German guns bullet for bullet. Instead, they waited, aimed, and fired in short, controlled bursts. The results were dramatic. Canadian casualties from machine gun fire dropped by more than a third. Suddenly, the Canadians were winning firefights they should have lost. The Germans noticed the change quickly. They started using different tactics to counter the Canadian Bren gunners. They dug their positions deeper, with more sandbags and overhead cover. They added more machine guns to each position, thinking that if the Canadians could knock out one gun, maybe they couldn't knock out 3. They tried firing from further away, beyond 200 meters, where they thought the Bren gun wouldn't be as accurate, but every counter-tactic the Germans tried ran into the same problem. The winter conditions in Italy were terrible. It rained constantly. The mud was everywhere. The cold was bitter, and in those conditions, the German MG-42 had problems. The gun fired so fast that it would overheat even in the cold weather. When the barrel got hot and then got wet from rain, it could warp. The gun would jam more often. Changing barrels in the mud and cold was difficult. The Bren gun didn't have these problems. It fired slower, so the barrel stayed cooler. It was simpler, with fewer parts that could break or jam, and that top-mounted magazine, the one that everyone used to complain about, turned out to be perfect for urban warfare. When a soldier needed to fire around a corner or over a wall, he could keep the gun low and still change magazines easily. The magazine stuck up where he could reach it. With the German guns, the magazines or ammunition belts fed from the side or bottom. In tight spaces, that made reloading much harder. British units fighting in Northwest Europe heard about the Canadian tactics and started using them too. By January 1945, British reports showed that units using precision Bren fire tactics had 40% fewer casualties than units using the old suppressive fire methods. 40%. That meant hundreds of soldiers who went home alive instead of going home in boxes. McLeod became something of a legend among the Bren gunners. When new soldiers arrived and were issued their Bren guns, the veterans would tell them McLeod's story. They'd tell them about the Germans laughing at the slow Canadian guns. They'd tell them about the 6 minutes that changed how everyone thought about the Bren. Years later, after the war was over, a military historian interviewed McLeod for a book about Canadian infantry tactics. McLeod told him, "They laughed at our slow gun until they realized every round we fired had a name on it. Speed doesn't matter if you're missing. A slow gun that hits beats a fast gun that doesn't, every time." The Army kept careful records of everything. By February 1945, just 2 months after McLeod's fight in Ortona, 186 different Canadian infantry sections had written reports documenting successful engagements using precision Bren fire tactics. 186 separate battles where the Canadians had been outgunned on paper, but won anyway because of better aim and better tactics. The rubble-strewn streets of Italian towns became classrooms where soldiers learned that the weapons manual didn't tell the whole story. The Bren gun specification said it fired 500 rounds per minute. The MG-42 specification said it fired 1 to 200 rounds per minute. On paper, the German gun was better. But in the real world, in the mud and cold and chaos of actual combat, the gun that could put bullets exactly where they needed to go was the one that won fights. The Christmas decorations kept hanging in those broken Italian windows all through the winter. Red and green ribbons that Italian mothers had put up before the war came to their streets. The decorations watched as Canadian soldiers learned that innovation wasn't always about having better equipment. Sometimes innovation was about using the equipment you had in a smarter way. Sometimes it was about a hunting guide from Nova Scotia who understood that patience and precision beat panic and speed. The distinct tack-tack-tack sound of Bren guns became something German soldiers learned to fear. That slow, deliberate sound meant Canadian gunners who didn't miss. It meant soldiers who'd learned McLeod's lesson. And it meant that laughing at the enemy's weapons was a good way to end up silent forever. The Bren gun stayed in service with the British and Canadian military forces for almost 50 years after the battle in Ortona. 50 years. The gun that fired slowly, the gun that German soldiers laughed at in 1944, remained the standard light machine gun until 1992. Soldiers who weren't even born when MacLeod fought in Italy carried the same basic weapon into conflicts around the world. The Falklands War in 1982, peacekeeping missions in Cyprus, training exercises in Germany during the Cold War. The Bren gun was there for all of it. But more important than the gun itself was what the gun had taught the military about how soldiers should fight. MacLeod's precision fire tactics didn't stay secret or special. They became standard practice. Infantry training manuals were rewritten. New soldiers in the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond learned to fire their automatic weapons in short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds. Aim at the target. Don't spray and pray. The doctrine had an official name now. They called it aimed automatic fire. But soldiers who'd been around long enough knew it was MacLeod's doctrine, the hunting guide's doctrine. When modern armies designed new squad automatic weapons to replace the Bren gun, they didn't try to make guns that fired faster and faster. They'd learned the lesson of the MG-42. Speed wasn't everything. Instead, they designed guns that a soldier could control better. Guns with better sights. Guns that stayed steadier when firing. Guns that let the shooter put bullets exactly where they needed to go. The American M249, the British L86, the Canadian C9. All of these modern weapons fire around 700 to 850 rounds per minute. Not as slow as the Bren's 500, but nowhere near the MG-42's 1200. The designers had found the sweet spot between speed and control. Military historians who study weapons and tactics point to the winter of 1944 in Italy as a turning point. That was when soldiers in the field proved that what looked good on paper didn't always work in real combat. The MG-42 had better specifications in almost every way. It fired faster. It fired a bigger bullet. It could keep firing longer before the barrel needed to be changed. But the Bren gun won firefights anyway because soldiers could aim it better. Because it worked in the mud and cold. Because it was simple and reliable. James MacLeod survived the war. He fought through the rest of the Italian campaign, then went with his unit to Holland for the final pushes against Germany in 1945. He was there when the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. He stood with thousands of other Canadian soldiers and watched the German army surrender. 3 years and 4 months after he'd left Nova Scotia to join the army, MacLeod got on a ship and sailed home. The Canadian government gave MacLeod the military medal for his actions at Ortona. It was a serious award given for acts of bravery in battle. The medal came with a citation that described how MacLeod had broken a German ambush and saved the lives of his platoon. But MacLeod didn't talk about the medal much. He didn't hang it on his wall or show it to people. He kept it in a drawer in his bedroom. When people asked him about the war, he would tell stories about the other soldiers he'd served with. About Private Chen, who went on to become a sergeant. About Lieutenant Harrison, who died in Holland in March 1945, just 2 months before the war ended. MacLeod went back to his old life as a hunting guide in Nova Scotia. He took city people out into the forest to hunt deer and bear, just like he'd done before the war. But he was different now. His hands were steady and his aim was perfect, but he didn't enjoy killing things anymore. He'd seen too much death in Italy and Holland. After a few years, he stopped being a hunting guide and became a forestry worker instead. He spent his days planting trees and managing woodlots, creating life instead of taking it. The forests of Nova Scotia were quiet compared to the streets of Ortona. No machine guns, no explosions, no young men screaming for medics. Just wind in the trees and the sound of MacLeod's axe. Sometimes on December mornings, when the air was cold and crisp like it had been that day in Italy, MacLeod would stop his work and remember. He would think about the tack-tack-tack sound of the Bren gun, about the feel of the trigger under his finger. About the moment when everything changed and the Germans stopped laughing. MacLeod died in 1987 at the age of 71. He never wrote a book about his experiences. He never gave speeches at military events. He was just a quiet man who'd done his job well when his country needed him. But the lessons he'd taught were still being taught to new soldiers. His name wasn't in the training manuals, but his methods were. The story of the Bren gun and the MG42 teaches us something important about innovation and human nature. We tend to think that better means faster, bigger, more powerful. We want the newest technology, the highest specifications, the most impressive numbers. But MacLeod showed that effectiveness isn't always about raw power. Sometimes it's about understanding what you have and using it in the smartest possible way. Modern military forces still struggle with this lesson. Every few years, there's a debate about whether soldiers need new rifles, or new vehicles, or new equipment. The debates always focus on specifications. How far does it shoot? How fast does it fire? How much does it weigh? These are important questions, but they're not the only questions. The real question is, will soldiers be able to use it effectively in actual combat conditions? Can they aim it when they're tired and scared and cold? Will it work when it's covered in mud? Can they maintain it with limited supplies? These practical concerns don't sound as exciting as talking about advanced technology and impressive specifications, but they're the concerns that actually matter when bullets start flying. MacLeod understood this because he'd been a hunting guide. He knew that the best rifle in the world was useless if the hunter couldn't hold it steady. He knew that missing fast was worse than hitting slow. The broader lesson goes beyond military weapons. In every part of life, we face the same choice between intensity and effectiveness. We can work longer hours, or we can work smarter. We can talk more, or we can say things that matter. We can move faster, or we can move in the right direction. Speed and power catch our attention. They seem impressive. But precision and purpose win in the end. The Germans laughed at the Canadian Bren gun because they measured deadliness in rounds per minute. The Canadians won because they measured it in rounds on target. One side counted bullets, the other side made bullets count. That difference, that fundamental difference in how you think about the problem, matters more than any technical specification ever could. In war, as in life, effectiveness beats intensity when precision meets courage. The slow gun that hits is better than the fast gun that misses. The careful approach succeeds where the frantic approach fails. And sometimes the wisdom you need comes not from experts with impressive credentials, but from a quiet hunting guide who understood one simple truth: every shot should have a name on it.